the title is A Neoclassical Theory of Culture, and I will just very briefly explain what I mean by all these terms. Neoclassical here means grounded in the classics in social theory. That is, we will try to extract from the social theories of Weber, Marx, Durkheim, and Simmel those elements that are most helpful in constructing a comprehensive theory of culture. So this term neoclassical means simply grounded in the classics in social theory. The term theory itself here means explanatory theory. That is, a theory that explains variations in culture, variations in cultural modes, variations in cultural representations. The term culture itself is, of course, very elusive and evasive. If we were asked to provide a concise definition of culture, most of us would probably be in a bit of trouble. And so I will start with just raising some questions. I will not be able to answer them in the current talk, but I just want to illuminate some of the questions and some of the directions towards which these questions point. And when we consider culture, we first consider its ontological status. And its ontological status can be captured in three basic questions. What is culture? How is culture? And where is culture in the world? Questions that are not normally asked, and they're not normally asked either by those who specialize in some kind of cultural studies. The term culture is normally taken for granted as obvious and unproblematic. Everyone is assumed to know what is meant by that term. But when we dig a little deeper and when we ask questions about the ontological status of culture, then that seeming consensus and shared understanding quickly breaks down. The question, what is culture, searches for its substance. What Western metaphysics refers to substance, and the substance is the core of something. It is what that something is in truth. So the question, what is culture, aims at the essence, the very core, the very substance of what that term denotes. The question, how is culture, investigates its mode of being. How is culture? What is its mode of existence? As opposed, for example, to rocks, trains, or states, culture may have a different mode of being. Its mode of existence may not be that of rocks or of trains. And so, when we ask how is culture, we are asking for the unique ontological mode of existence in which culture occurs in the world. And that leads to the third important question we can ask when considering culture. Where is it in the world? And here there are two major possibilities that have been explored in the tradition of cultural research. And one possibility says culture is an in here. And that means culture belongs to the inside of the human mind. We cannot find culture out there in the same way that we can find physical or material objects that occur in the world out there. Culture does not seem to occur in the same way. Rather, since culture usually is said to have something to do with meaning, meaning is an in here, and so culture is likened to a mental state. And that mental state carries meaning, and culture is the way in which these subjective, mental, meaningful states are formed. The opposite position is that culture is not an in here, but rather an out there. And here the most important example for this out there is language. We will see a close affinity between these two concepts, language and culture. A language is clearly not an in here. Those who use language, those who use words, may associate certain meanings with those, but questions of meaning are usually not settled on the inside of minds. And so we have these two possible alternatives when it comes to the ontological question of where we need to look when we want to know what culture is, substance, and how it is, its mode of being. Now, the next question that will get us closer to the phenomenon of culture is there a single culture with a capital C? Or are there only plural cultures with a lowercase c? This is related to the question whether culture with a capital C is universal, whether or not there are cultural universals, or whether culture is rather local, contextual, and historical, and occurs only in the massive plural. So that is a bone of contention which is related to the age-old debate between realism and relativism. So a single culture would be a realist culture because it is the only authority in town, if you will. Whereas when there are plural cultures which have only limited local and historical significance, then relativism is more of an appropriate worldview. So the question, single or plural, universal or local, concerns some very deep-seated controversies in the history of Occidental metaphysics and philosophy. And then the final alternative that I just want to hint at, I do not want to, at this point, try an answer to these questions. We will get to that in the second part of the talk in December, and that is the alternative hierarchical or lateral. If culture is a hierarchical structure, then it must be possible to rank cultures on a hierarchy such as a pyramid. A very good example for this would be the classical, traditional Indian caste cultures, which are very hierarchical and in which the top culture is seen to be that exemplar which all the other caste or class cultures should emulate. In a hierarchical culture, everything of value is concentrated at the top, and the flow goes from top to bottom, and social status is determined by proximity to the apex, while at the same time there exist very strict restrictions on interchanges and interactions among the practices, the cultural habits and customs of various caste cultures. The opposite possibility is that it is not feasible to arrange different cultures in a hierarchical rank ordering, and hence culture is not hierarchical but lateral. Different cultures are just different, but we cannot say one culture is somehow superior, more advanced, more valuable than another. And so you see that this question, hierarchical or lateral, is also related to the question of realism and relativism. A hierarchical organization of cultural ranks is of necessity realist, because realism, the real culture, is concentrated at the top, whereas lateral cultures give rise to a more relativistic outlook. Now, our third preliminary observation when we are trying to approach the phenomenon of culture is that the term is ubiquitous throughout the social sciences and the humanities, so that, for example, we have cultural anthropology, but we also now have a cultural sociology. We have also a sociology of culture, which is not the same as cultural sociology at all. In fact, the two are rather bitter rivals. We use the term subculture as well, and so the term is ubiquitous. Not only do we speak of Western culture, we also speak of, within Western culture, French culture. And within French culture, we speak of French working class culture. And so the term operates on very many different levels. It captures phenomena in a wide variety of areas. It can be used to refer to entire disciplines, or it can be referred to the phenomena that these disciplines study. However, despite the ubiquity of the term culture, there is a lack of shared understanding in its ontological status. Exactly what it is, its substance, how it is, its mode of being, and where it is, its location, either as an inside or an outside. And so, in order to address this problem, it helps to remember that culture has an other side. And so, if we contrast culture with its other side, then maybe we get more clues about what culture is as well, if we contrast it with that which it is not, with its other. And when we do that, then we run into one of the most fundamental and deep-seated dualisms in the history of Western thinking, and that is the difference between culture and nature. And their relations. Normally, this divide between culture and nature is very closely demarcated. So there is a rigid dividing line to the extent that something belongs either to culture or to nature. This distinction between culture and nature is grounded in the distinction between subject and object. And that distinction between subject and object runs through the entire history of metaphysics in its modern incarnation. That is, the metaphysics of modernity is a metaphysics of this distinction, subject-object, and that leads from Descartes to Kant to Hegel, and in some sense all the way to Nietzsche. What all these metaphysical positions have in common is that they draw a fundamental distinction between subject and object. And for example, our difference that we still use, this is not an old philosophical antiquarian topic. Rather, our talk about mind and body follows the same fundamentally dualistic logic, where mind belongs more to the subject side of things and the body is more on the object side of things. And likewise, this ontological difference between the being of the subject and the being of the object triggers an epistemological dualism as well. So, ontology triggers epistemology, so that we have the classical discussion since the late 19th century, starting with the historical school in Germany, between the logic of interpretation and the logic of explanation. And that is often associated with the so-called Methodenstreit, the debate on methodology, which also takes place in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. The sciences of culture, subject, mind, interpret or understand, whereas the sciences of nature explain. And the logic of these is different, so that we need two different logics of science, one for the sciences of culture and one for the sciences of nature, which of course then leads to the question, in what sense are the sciences of culture sciences at all, if the sciences of nature are used as our paradigm case of what a science is, and if we use the sciences of nature, particularly physics, in its classical version, Newtonian version, as the paradigm for what a science is, then the sciences of culture do not seem to match the rigor of physics, and so the question is, in what sense are the sciences of culture sciences at all? And so we have the distinction between soft and hard as well. The soft sciences, the hard sciences. So this dualism runs through the entire history of Western thinking, where culture is opposed to nature, and where nature is seen as object, and culture is seen as subject. The subject is the mode of being of the human being. It is the how of the human being. And so the answer from Descartes all the way to Hegel and Nietzsche, who are we as human beings, is that the being of the human being, its unique mode of being, is as subject. This tradition of the philosophy of the subject continues to this very day. There are some echoes of this metaphysics in our term person or actor. These are metaphysical decay products of the subject. Once the subject is being dethroned, and that starts to happen after Hegel, the subject turns into person or actor. But we see that our current notions in social theory, such as actor, are still grounded in the metaphysics of the subject and therefore carry a lot of the metaphysical baggage of these terms. So the subject is the being of the human being, its mode of being. The human being is as subject, and that means first and foremost, and here we get close to the notion of culture and meaning, to consciousness. And that is a very mysterious and intractable problem, the problem of what consciousness is. Philosophers of mind, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, some social psychologists, all of them try to figure out what consciousness is. Consciousness, whatever it is the mode of being of the subject. The subject is as consciousness. Not so for the object. The object is not a consciousness. The object is not an entity, is not a being that could say I to itself. It does not identify itself, and so it lacks ego. Since the scientific revolution of the 17th century, since Newton's classical mechanics, the object is defined as mass in motion. So that the task of physics and other natural sciences now becomes to discover the laws that drive the behavior of mass in motion. The object is the being of the non-human being, the being of, roughly speaking, nature. And nature is seen as object, and object is seen as mass in motion. And so physics is charged with discovering the laws that govern mass in motion. And from this idea stems the idea of what an explanation